Good evening, afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Adam Smith Institute webinar. I'm Morgan Schonlemeyer, the Head of External Affairs at the ASI, and I'm thrilled to be bringing you another webinar, this time in analysis of the United States election. As we all know, this election proved to be one unlike any other. With record turnout, record numbers of early and mail-in votes, and astonishing twists and turns on election night and the many following nights, there is a lot to discuss. I think of all the topics we have and could possibly cover on this ASI webinar series, this one is least in need of a long introduction. And I'd rather save time for questions from you, our audience, who I'm sure are all experts on the intricacies of Maricopa County. So let me just say that the ASI does not take political sides. We are just here to discuss and analyze some of the most interesting aspects of the election, both before, during, and after. So without further ado, let me welcome our guests. Joining us from London is Molly Canary, who is a postgraduate student of economics and social history at the University of Cambridge, previously a researcher at the Legatum Institute, and an active member of Republicans Overseas UK. She also previously worked with Babson Global, the International Roundtable on Trade and Competition, and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Her columns have been published in The Telegraph, City IM, and Sydney Morning Herald. Joining us from America, we have Eli Dorado, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. He focuses on the hard technology and innovation needed to drive large increases in economic growth. He runs an election tracking blog focusing on using betting markets to predict results instead of polling. And finally, let's welcome Colin Mortimer, who is the director of the Neoliberal Project at PPI and founder and director of the Center for New Liberalism. Prior to joining PPI, Colin was a consultant at Bates White Economic Consulting, focusing on healthcare antitrust. I'd like to invite my guests to give us a brief introduction to the discussion as they tell us what they found to be the most interesting aspect of the election. Then we will move on to a chaired discussion, followed by audience Q&A. You can submit your questions below using the Q&A function. So, Colin, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off with your thoughts on how the election went down.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you to the Adam Smith Institute for this invitation. So I think it's cliche to say this at this point, but truly I believe that this election outcome is probably the most transformative in decades, and it's probably the most impactful on American politics going into the future, probably for some time. And I think a really easy way to put this is that this is a huge victory for American liberalism. This election was a repudiation of conservative populism. There was repudiation of Trumpism, more importantly, and it was a signal from the American electorate for their desire to return to some sort of normalcy within American politics. For Donald Trump to become a one-term president, it shows the strength of American institutions and the desire of the American people to return to some sort of dignity in our government and the way that we run our country. Joe Biden, for all of his faults, will give institutions in America 4 years to heal themselves, to have some breathing room, so that regardless of who the next president is, whether it's Joe Biden again, a different Democrat, or a Republican, that we can hopefully move forward in a way that is more constructive and healthy for America. Obviously, with this election, though, Democrats went in with the expectation that they would be taking the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And while they kept the House and did take the presidency, it is looking unlikely that they'll take the entire Senate, though some remains to be seen come the Georgia runoffs in January. But this divided government, I do think, is healthy for America in some ways. You're not going to see any sort of radical transformation in favor of liberals or conservatives, but you're actually going to see America's government have to sit down and come up with bipartisan compromise on various issues that really need to be addressed. The coronavirus cannot be ignored, and it will require Republicans and Democrats to work together to come up with a bill, hopefully before January, but if not before January, in January after Joe Biden becomes president. But despite what people have said online and in the news media, Democrats did very well this election. They kept the House, they took additional Senate seats, and they won the presidency and made Donald Trump a one-term president, which is an achievement that should not be understated. Finally, but this election exposed holes in the Democrats' ability to win elections, particularly in their lack of gains or their loss in electoral share amongst Latinos and Black voters. And it's also showing the fractures within the Democratic Party between the left, with members like AOC and Rashida Tlaib, who are in the progressive side of the House, and more moderate members like Connor Lamb, who represents swing districts in states like Pennsylvania. So this will be an important election, mostly at the presidential level. But I think what's going to be really interesting to see over the next 2 years and 4 years is how this shapes up in the House and how this transforms the Democratic Party. And hopefully we can talk about that later in this webinar.
Thank you, Colin, for that. I'd now like to go to Eli, who is joining us from DC as well, for his thoughts on the election, both the night of, during, after, before. What are your thoughts, Eli?
Well, thank you, Morgan, and thank you to ASI for having me. It's such a pleasure to participate in what I think will be a very lively and fun event. I see things a little different than Colin does. You know, I was happy with the final outcome as well, but you know, this election was far closer than a lot of people expected. So I just looked this morning and at the sort of the vote count, and the margins in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin are all around or under 20,000 votes in each of those states. So that means that if you added 50,000 Trump votes in the right places, in the right proportions, you'd flip those states. Another way to look at it, of course, is that you could actually just, instead of adding 50,000 Trump votes, you could flip 25,000 Biden votes in the right place, because, you know, flipping votes, you'd have one fewer Biden vote and one more Trump vote. So that means that what this election came down to was 25,000 votes out of 150 million cast. So that's 0.017% of the votes. That's what it came down to. So if you flip those three states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, you would have ended up with a 269 to 269 tie in the Electoral College, which would have sent the election to Congress to decide, which I think would have been, you know, most appropriate for the year we've been having in terms of an outcome. So, you know, I don't think anybody really saw this coming. The polls certainly didn't see this coming, that it would be this close. None of the poll-based forecasters saw this coming. So I think that, you know, if we're candid with ourselves, you know, this election result came as a shock to a lot of people. But interestingly, it was not a shock to the people who took the betting market seriously. So as Morgan said, I run on my personal website a page that tracks election projections according to data from Betfair, which is by far the most liquid political betting market. And Betfair basically called it right. If you look at the betting markets right before the election, they said it was closer than the pollsters and the forecasters thought. They got Florida right, which was one of the first signs on election night that the polls were off. And they said it would be close in Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina, and it was. So before the polls closed on election night, I tweeted out a picture of a Monte Carlo simulation run on the state-based betting markets, and the distribution of Electoral College votes for Biden was centered right on 306. So it got that right. And you know, basically, if you go state by state in terms of what they, you know, what the betting markets were predicting, and take like a point estimate of what they said, the only thing they got wrong was sort of swapping. You know, they called all the states right except for North Carolina and Georgia, which were both very close states that they kind of swapped, and they said it would be close in both of those in those states, and it got sort of got it on the wrong side of the knife edge. So I think it was a big surprise, the sort of the outcome. I don't lament the outcome. I do agree with Colin that it's you know, positive for the world that that Biden was elected, and that you know, divided government in terms of, you know, Republican Senate might also benefit America. So I'm not lamenting the outcome, but I do think it is shocking that, you know, 71 million Americans voted to re-elect Trump, and we came within, you know, 25 or 50,000 votes of actually having him win the election, or at least sending it to the Congress to decide. So really quite a much closer election than I think most of us were expecting, and quite shocking, and lots to discuss further on this panel.
Thank you, Eli. We'll definitely get back to the betting markets and what the pollsters got wrong or got right. And we have some questions from our audience to that effect as well already. But let's finish up our opening statements with Molly, and then we'll move on to our chaired Q&A. Molly, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Just to echo Eli and Colin's sentiments. I must say I agree with Colin that I think that this is in many ways the most desirable outcome for the libertarian wing of the GOP, holding control of the Senate in the midst of a incoming Democratic administration and Democratic-controlled House. I think that the performance of the stock market, the American stock market over the previous couple of days has certainly vindicated that position. There seems to be a degree of enthusiasm on Wall Street for the notion that serious increases in taxes are unlikely, and that major regulatory changes beyond the scope of what's possible with the signature of a presidential pen, those will not be happening either. Possibly I'm just reading my own experience into this, but I thought that this election was in many ways a sign of exhaustion amongst the American electorate, really on all sides, and a sign of retrenchment. President Trump increased his share of the total vote by about 8 million to over 71 million votes, and some of those are still being counted, although the result now looks clear. And I think we now face really nothing short of a battle for the soul of the GOP. And I don't say that lightly. I am a registered Republican. I was for a while the spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. And the schism which Trumpism has produced within the party really should not be underestimated, because there is an almost complete ideological split between those who would support the president and his actual policies and those who would simply support the notion of staying in power, which I think is where a lot of his support, certainly within the establishment of the party, came from. And as for what happens next, I think obviously the runoff races in Georgia, both Senate races are now going to be up for grabs on the 5th of January. That is going to be hugely significant, possibly in forcing Mitch McConnell's hand to act in a way which may do very little to preserve this administration, but to attempt to preserve control of that body. But also, and I'm sure that we will get into this, the polling breakdowns, and specifically the ethnic polling breakdowns, were particularly interesting to me. The GOP made very significant gains amongst Asian Americans, as well as a host of other minority communities, the Latino community, but far beyond the typical Cuban base that it picks up in South Florida, as well as the Haitian vote. And I think that this shows, first of all, that a Republican president or candidate who is willing to make very specific overtures on issues which affect these groups, like affirmative action in the case of Asian Americans, or on foreign policy, can make real inroads. And I certainly hope that that is going to remain at the forefront of the party's mind going forward, that it is absolutely possible to expand beyond the ordinary heavily white base that the party is able to bring in.
Thank you, Molly. You guys are making my job easy because you're all alluding to things that I'd like to address in our chaired questions. So if I can bring in my other panelists, we'll start our chaired Q&A with myself, some questions that I've thought of in advance. And like I said, we're already getting some great questions in from our audience. So we'll touch on those later. But Ela, I'd like to start with some pre-election analysis. So you mentioned your election blog, and you used betting markets to predict the result, and you found that to be much more accurate. And we know that in 2016, polling was off. We found the polling was off in this election. Is this the end of the polling apparatus? And what is it that they're not catching? Is there very specific sectors of the electorate that they're just not catching, they didn't correct for this time around?
Well, great question. I think it is useful to compare 2016 to 2020 because I think they are different in some respects. So in 2016, most of the forecasts said Clinton would win comfortably. There was one exception, which was Nate Silver at 538, who said, no, this is close, right? That he gave Trump a sort of a 30% chance of winning, which is, 30%. 30% is, not quite a coin flip, right? But it's not outside the realm of possibility. So, and what's interesting is that in 2016, the betting markets kind of agreed with Nate. So if you followed Nate's forecast in 2016 and betting markets odds, they were pretty much in line with each other. And then the other sort of like poll-based forecasters were way off in left field, giving Clinton a much better chance. So this year there was much further divergence. So you had sort of like the non-Nate forecasters, like The Economist, like gave Biden a 97% chance of victory going into the election. And 538, Nate Silver's outfit said it was not quite that high. They said it was around 90%. And then betting market said it was around 70%, right? So throughout the whole betting cycle, you had the betting market saying like, using like, if you think about the differential between their forecast and the 538 forecast, it was about 10 to 20 points the entire time. And, this caused a lot of lashing out. I think Nate said on Twitter that betting markets are stupid and they suffer from a Dunning-Kruger effect, which is interesting to see. So, I think what we've seen is that, betting markets are quite good at forecasting. They're not magic and they don't automatically get the right result, but they are able to capture some of the blind spots that the poll-based forecasters miss. And I would be nervous in 2024 if my forecast didn't match what the betting markets were saying. Now, in terms of what the polls actually missed, I think that the biggest thing is non-response bias. So the kind of person who picks up the phone and answers a survey, it's a kind of special kind of person, right? Most people, they don't answer the phone if they don't recognize the number. If you do pick it up and you realize it's a survey, a lot of people just hang up. So like, who doesn't hang up the phone when they find out that it's a political pollster? I think it's bored liberals, right? It's like, they're in lockdown because of coronavirus. Like they hate Trump and they want to tell everybody who will listen that they hate Trump. And like, I think that they just sort of were overrepresented in the polls because like they were the most willing to answer a survey. So that's what does that mean for the future? If it is the case that you sort of like are diverging politically between sort of the kinds of people that would answer a poll and not answer a poll. In the past, those haven't like broken down on party lines, but if we are sort of like realigning along those lines, and that does spell a pretty bad future for the future of political polling as we've done it. So it's possible polls are broken until someone figures out how to fix them.
And I think we thought that maybe 2016 was a fluke. So it is really interesting to hear that a lot of the same problems happened in 2020 and like you said, maybe in 2024. Molly, I think related to the polling issues, you kind of alluded to it in your introduction, were all the changing demographics, which can be quite hard to pin down if you don't know exactly how these groups are going to vote. So we had shifts in voting patterns within racial groups. As you mentioned, Trump increased his share of the vote in a lot of ethnic minorities. Granted, it was from small to slightly less small, but he still did see gains. We also had the suburbs versus rural versus city shift, big influence of expanding suburbs, especially in places like Georgia and Michigan and the like. So how big of a role did changing demographics play? And do you think these shifts were really surprising on election night?
Well, as Eli was saying earlier, it really doesn't take all that much, particularly in the key swing states, which possibly is a strange thing to say in an election of almost 150 million votes. But tens of thousands of people voting in the correct states can absolutely shift the balance, which is what we saw in 2016. And Vice President Biden, well now President-elect Biden's failure to make a broader appeal to those minority groups in Florida specifically, and to bring them out in Miami, I think absolutely contributed to his loss of that state and our delay in finding out what the result of the election was going to be. So I suppose what I'm saying is that these are groups which I certainly don't want to suggest that they've been ignored by the Republican Party in the past, but because they haven't formed part of the traditional coalition, the outreach efforts have not necessarily been quite as strong. And simply proving that that not need be the case is, to my mind, quite significant moving forward, because the demographic trends of the United States suggest that, as a share of the total population, white suburbanites are going to become far less significant over the coming decades. And the multiplicity of Hispanic populations which exist within the country, and that I should just add as a particular bugbear of mine, I started off my career working for the Republican congresswoman from Miami on Capitol Hill. And so it is very important that we not talk about the Latino community as a single voting bloc. There are huge schisms within that, just as there are huge schisms within the African-American community, et cetera, et cetera. But simply showing that enough votes can be peeled off here and there will hopefully encourage not just pandering, but also legislation on that basis to try and draw in those folks who might not naturally be supporters.
Right. I would like to get back to policies and what we might be seeing from a Biden administration later on. But Colin, I want to touch on the hot topic of the last week, which is election fraud. What is your assessment of the election fraud debate?
Certainly, I'll answer that, and then I quickly want to respond to both Eli's and Molly's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Answers. I think the election fraud is mostly a political tool, ultimately, and as we're seeing from the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, to be more specific, it's specifically a fundraising tool to settle the debt that the campaign has incurred. But there is a real concern about election fraud. Obviously, we want to have free and fair elections, but ultimately, in the places where the strategies that it's being alleged, there's an obvious political bias to it. We're not seeing it being alleged in places Republicans won. We're seeing it being alleged in places Democrats won. We've had strategies like mail-in voting that have been universal in states like Utah, California, Colorado for years, and we've never had widespread fraud as a result of it. Obviously, we're going to see these one-off cases of someone voting on behalf of their dead grandmother or someone attempting to vote twice, and those should be prosecuted and investigated, but not to the degree in which we're going to be seeing tens of thousands of votes on behalf of one candidate or election shifting fraud. And then just quickly responding to Eli, I've always been a critic of betting odds as a predictor of elections for a variety of reasons, not necessarily being a polling show. I think Eli's criticisms of polling are actually really accurate. There was an excellent interview in Vox today with Democratic political operative David Shore, where he basically talks about because conservatives are low trust, they are much less likely to respond to surveys when people are calling them in. And that's going to bias the polls. Like, obviously, you can wait ex post facto and try to get to the approximate percentage, but if you're getting such a low sample size, you're going to have difficulty approximating this kind of stuff. But betting markets also have a number of pitfalls. There's a large male bias within betting markets. It's predominantly men who bet in these markets, and men trend more conservative than women. You have a lot of survivorship bias from 2016. The people who were betting in the markets in 2020 were the ones who got it right in 2016. If I bet tens of thousands of dollars on Hillary winning, I'm probably less inclined to vote on behalf of Joe Biden this time around. And then finally, betting markets are also incredibly volatile to shifts. And we saw this on election night. I followed Eli's website on election night, and Eli's website, in addition to Betfair, at one point in the evening had Trump at winning the election 80% odds, at least on Betfair is around 80% odds. And ultimately now we know that the odds ended up being much closer to what they were pre-election. So they're suspect to these massive shifts that actually don't represent the real outcome. So that's not to say that betting markets are not a useful tool. I do think that they get at some of the bias that polls have, but in the future, we might actually see, similar to what happened in 2020, that the polls are biased against conservatives. And if the betting markets are also biased on behalf of conservatives, then we might actually see betting markets have a larger error than the polls. And then for the Latino vote, I think the biggest debate that we're going to see within the Democratic Party is whether this is a permanent shift in the direction of Republicans or a temporary shift. I tend to believe that this is going to be a temporary shift and a permanent shift. I do think we will see that Hispanics and minority voters will trend towards the Republican Party as we begin to see things like education and class begin to sort more along party lines. But I think there's also a lot of indications that this is a temporary shift due to coronavirus, basically coronavirus. Latino voters reported that they were incredibly satisfied with the stimulus checks they got with Trump's name on it, and that might have put the election towards Trump. And I don't think we're going to see stimulus checks anytime soon, where I hope there is not a reason for stimulus checks anytime soon. And Latino voters, more so than other voters, rely on in-person interaction, canvassing, door knocking than other voters. And the Trump campaign notoriously was still doing that during the coronavirus pandemic. And the Joe Biden campaign halted that until the very end of the election when they started to get worried about the Latino vote. So in 2024, when those are both back, hope to God, back in 2024, post-coronavirus, I do think we'll see the Democrats take back some of the losses they had amongst the Latino and the Black vote this election.
Thank you. I appreciated you addressing Eli and Molly's points. Did either of you want to counter address Colin's points? If not, I have a quick question for Eli. Or Eli,
I'm happy to address the sort of betting market denialism that Colin has brought to the discussion, and you know, particularly on the sort of like election night swings. I think that it was actually like true uncertainty about what was going to happen. And I think that what betting markets are good at is sort of like summarizing, taking a wide variety of inputs and summarizing it into a single number, right? And I think that's what they did quite effectively. And in terms of like, you know, sort of like gender biases and stuff, I think the other wonderful thing about betting markets is that, you know, money doesn't have a gender, right? Like money, like these are people with skin in the game and putting money down, and you know, if they're wrong, they lose money. And so very, very strong incentive to get it right. And that, I think, you know, you know, we'll see, like maybe at some point in the future, there will be a sort of an election where, you know, it's like the male bias like starts to matter, and then all those people will lose money. And so that will be very interesting, you know. So it is a self-correcting mechanism. And I think people sort of undervalue it at their peril. Although, as I said in my other remarks, they're not magic, right? It's not automatically right. It's just a very good mechanism.
Sure. Molly, one of the big questions that we have is this a rejection of Trumpism? Half the people you ask will say yes, because he underperformed in relation to down ballot Republicans, and he lost. And others will say no, he got 8 million more votes, and again, like you said, gained in a number of different voter categories. So I think you alluded to it a little bit, but could you expand on this argument and why people are so strongly on either side of this answer?
Sure. I think to begin with, I'm aware that we probably have a primarily British audience tonight, and we haven't mentioned this yet. It would be very dangerous to underestimate the extent to which there are single issue voting blocks within the United States. And one of the major, possibly the biggest single issue voting bloc in the United States is on the question of abortion, which now sort of in a post Roe v. Wade world is going to be adjudicated really at this stage entirely through the courts, which is part of why we saw the intensity of the battle that we did over Amy Coney Barrett's nomination a few weeks ago. Feels really like a lifetime. So I think in that sense, there's a floor through which the GOP is unlikely to ever fall unless there is some sort of major social shift in the way that people think about those issues, which I don't see happening for, at least another decade. In terms of a rejection of Trumpism more broadly, I think that there is I do think that there was a rejection of the politics of the Trump era. This notion that people simply don't want to have to pay that much attention to the news every day. And it is incredibly fatiguing. And I think that that certainly would be true for any British folks who like to keep up with American politics. But I went home over the summer for 6 weeks. I was back in DC, and it really is quite noticeable how truly inescapable it is. And that is partially a function of it being an inherently political environment. But just in terms of the news coverage, it really is 24 hours a day. There's always something chaotic happening. The firing of the Secretary of Defense yesterday via Twitter is, quite frankly, just the latest in a long string of doing politics via tweet and running the country, frankly, via tweet. So the politics of Trumpism, I think, may be, I don't want to believe that this is true, so I'm aware of my own bias here. Some of it may be here to stay. The sort of coalescence of views around international trade, in particular between the Democratic and Republican parties, suggests to me that this is the sort of thing that we are unlikely to see a major shift on going into a Biden administration and whichever administrations come after. And I think that Trump was a particularly significant individual in shifting the public mood on that issue and making people aware that that was an issue which they could impact with their own votes. But the actual day-to-day functioning of it is, quite frankly, far too much. And the vast majority of Americans simply don't care about politics that much, and they do not want to be asked to care about politics that much.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the argument about Sleepy Joe was quite appealing to a lot of people, just wanting someone to just relax for 4 years. Colin, if this isn't a rejection of Trumpism, what is the path forward for Biden in terms of policies, in terms of statesmanship? What do you see the role of Biden in a divided America?
I think that's a really tough question to answer. I think it's going to depend a lot on the willingness of Republicans in the Senate to want to cooperate with him. I do think, though, that Molly's point is correct. But the Biden election, regardless if you're a Democrat or a Republican, is a chance to relax for at least 4 years, for the news cycle to slow down, for people to be able to pay attention to other happenings in the world besides the latest scandal in the White House. And I think it does bring back some respect and some dignity to the White House. You can say whatever you want about the White House over the past 4 years and their achievements, but it has certainly not improved the perception of the American government within the United States to some degree, but especially abroad. And I think Joe Biden, regardless of what he does policy-wise in Congress, is going to improve America's perception across the world and within the country. I think that for the rejection of Trumpism, though, it totally depends on what happens in 2024. We're going to see an interesting crop of candidates come up, some inspired by Trumpism, some seeking to reject it. But I do think in the end, we will end up somewhere where you have a figure like Josh Hawley, to a lesser degree, Tom Cotton, or even maybe Marco Rubio, who take the lessons of Trumpism where you do more of an appeal to the working class, you do some aspects of economic populism, but you run hard on the social conservative angle. And I think we might see that become popular. And I worry that a less chaotic candidate running on Trumpism might be able to do more damage than Trump did over the past 4 years.
That is an interesting thought that hadn't occurred to me. I have 2 more questions for our panelists before we get to some Q&A, and we have a lot of really good ones coming in, so be sure to keep sending in your questions. Eli, in terms of policy, your work with the Center for Growth and Opportunity centers around finding innovations that will really drive growth. So we're going to need a lot of growth following a global recession in the face of COVID. So what are some policies that you'd like to see from a Biden administration that would drive growth, maybe something that Trump hadn't tried? What are your hopes for the next 4 years?
That's a great point. So I think, so Biden has the right impulse, right? What he said in his victory speech was, it's time to heal the country. And I think if you look at sort of the growth we've had over the last 15 years, it's been minuscule, right? So in the 1950s and 60s, like total factor productivity grew at around 2% per year. And over the last 15 years, it's been grown at about 1/8 of that, 0.26%. So that's tiny. And so, what I'd like to see him do is sort of do a lot of innovation in sort of in health, right? Or like focus on sort of like population level health, on lots of things that would increase productivity in terms of making us healthier without having to actually get more medical care. So things like focusing on biological aging, focus on getting more and smarter devices in the hands of consumers that let them be able to look after their own health. Health is 18% of GDP, so it's huge. I'd like to see the Biden administration really take a hard line on sort of housing policy, on zoning, abolish zoning. If the far left of the Democrats wants an extreme slogan, that would be a great one. Instead of defund the police, abolish zoning would be amazing. And things like energy, right? Climate is a priority for the Biden administration, but doing it instead of sort of like this, we're going to create like lots of like union jobs through like the green industry. Instead of focusing on like job creation, which is ultimately a cost, like focus on new technologies that can deliver clean energy cheaper than we've ever had it before, right? So increasing productivity there. And then the other thing I'd like to see is in transportation. So I used to work for a supersonic airplane company, and I'd love to see a supersonic flight between London and the United States again, and maybe many more other places beside that. But transportation is actually like a very levered area where if you get some breakthroughs in terms of high-speed rail, urban air mobility, supersonic flight, et cetera, you could actually have a lot of growth dividends. So health, housing, energy, and transportation, Biden should focus on those, and that would heal the country. It would sort of diminish the populism that we've experienced because of the low growth for the last decade and a half.
Those are the policies we like to hear at the ASI. I think we have a paper on just about every one of those.
Great.
Molly, we saw a few minutes before we started actually that Boris was one of the first international leaders to get a phone call from President-elect Biden. So for our transatlantic audience, which actually I think quite a few of our attendees might be from both sides of the pond, what does the Biden administration mean for a UK-US trade deal and the ongoing special relationship?
Sure. I personally think slightly too much has been made of the fact that President-elect Biden is of Irish heritage. I think it's something like a quarter of the United States is of some kind of Irish heritage. I am one of them. And while we certainly enjoy drinking beer on St. Patrick's Day, that doesn't necessarily mean that policy is or will be defined by those sort of cultural links. I imagine that much will remain the same. I can't see a huge deviation in the normal operating posture of how that relationship functions. Although it should be said that what's happened over the past 4 years, to my mind at least, has been a major shift in the way that certainly the presidential administration chose to engage very directly on issues in British politics down to the level of the mayor of London. And I think we will certainly see a step back in terms of that posture, which I personally would welcome. You asked specifically about the prospects for a US-UK free trade agreement. The fundamentals of that in terms of what the United States Trade Representative, USTR, would be asking for, again, I don't think are going to shift a huge amount, because the United States has actually a very well-developed process for taking in the views of its business community before it approaches any kind of free trade agreement. And those views are fairly stable in terms of what different American companies and sectors would like to see out of a potential FTA. And I don't imagine that any protests from the Irish government would help. I think members of Congress, particularly Democratic members of Congress, and particularly those who were still in office when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, would be deeply unwilling to do anything which might endanger that peacekeeping agreement. But at the end of the day, it has always seemed, to me at least, to be something of a no-brainer, which does not mean that there will not need to be concessions made on both sides, particularly with regards to British agricultural imports, but everything is possible.
That is one that we will see play out in the coming months, I suppose. I think we'll move on to questions from our audience, and we have quite a few interesting ones. One that jumps out to me reminds me of a interesting Twitter thread I saw, which was which country has the best electoral method? Which country has the best system for electing their leaders? So our anonymous attendee asks, if you were designing an election process on the clean sheet, how similar would it look to the US process? And I guess let's answer that Twitter question. What country do you think has the best electoral system? Eli, maybe go first.
Sure. So the best electoral system, I would have to say, my friend Dalibor Rohak wrote a piece on medieval Venice and how they elected the Doge, and it was extremely convoluted, and basically you could not. There was no conceivable way that you could like plan to be elected because it was such a convoluted system that you couldn't like really run for it. And so what it ended up is like the last step is like, you know, some near random people but who maybe are more respected than average like get together and pick somebody. And that was that to me is like a pretty good system, because you don't get this sort of like decade long like ambition to run for presidency. How would I design it if I were designing it differently? I think one thing I would do is I would try to do a Condorcet method, right? So where people vote, they rank the candidates, and then you do pairwise comparisons between the different candidates that are named on the ballots, and then if somebody beats all other candidates and it's sort of a pairwise race, then they're the best candidate. And if not, then you have to have some other method of sort of the set of candidates that don't defeat each other, everybody else in that set. The smallest version of that, like you would need to have some tie-breaking method. But I think the advantage of that is that you'd get more, you'd increase the incentive to run in sort of like a broad appeal kind of candidacy. You would increase the incentive for your party to run that way and to sort of present itself that way. And you would open up the field for more competition between the parties. So if you end up in a place where it seems like the US is going through some sort of realignment, you'd have that happen formally through parties that are competing with each other. And you can't take away votes from each other by sort of, running a third party under a Condorcet method. So that's probably how I would do it. I think it would be interesting to see a world where you have more competition between new entrant parties.
Does anybody else want to take that question, Colin or Molly?
I'll add quickly that one thing I've always admired about the UK system is the strength of the parties in UK. A problem that we actually saw this election is that because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are so weak, that they have little control over the fundraising and the quality of candidates that pop up. So for example, the Democratic candidates in Kentucky and South Carolina rose over $100 million each, which is larger than the GDP of several small countries in this world. But they lost the races miserably. in an ideal world, the Democratic Party would, one, run stronger candidates that have a better chance of winning in those places, but two, not give them so much money, where that money could have been deployed more effectively in swingier House races or Senate races. But then moving to more realistic reforms that need to be done in America, I mean, I think two institutions that have really outlived their usefulness are the Electoral College and the current way that we do our Senate system. Back in the day, the United States had far less federalism. People had much more of a state identity, and our politics happened much more on the state level. But we've kind of like hacked our way to this system now where our elections are still administered and really state focused, but people really care about what happens on the federal level. So having some way that was more proportionate to be representative to in the Senate for populations would be a dramatic improvement. And then just straight abolishing the Electoral College would be an improvement, simply because it just doesn't reflect the desires of Americans anymore for who they want to be president. And then finally, while I think Americans might revolt if an electoral system as complicated as Eli's was implemented, even though I admire it, I think something as simple as ranked choice voting would be a dramatic improvement for American elections, because it would give more moderate candidates a chance to win, and also increase the influence of third parties. And we've seen some states put it in place, and it's really effective. And I hope more states adopt it as well.
Yeah.
Holly, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just very briefly, Colin touched on this. I am of the ilk of the Republican Party which would like to see private money completely abolished in politics, which would require at this stage either a Supreme Court decision overturning Citizens United, which I think is probably quite unlikely, or a constitutional amendment, which is also a very high bar to clear. But in as much as we're talking about the election of the Venetian Doge and our dream world of what the American political system could look like, I think providing some set amount of public money for those who manage to clear a certain bar in, say, primary elections, and taking the additional funding out of it would be hugely helpful, not just to shortening our elections, which quite frankly are far too long, but also in terms of restoring some trust, which is seriously lacking at this stage amongst the electorate itself, that their votes matter and that their voices matter, and that those are the primary sort of factors which determine who gets elected and who doesn't, and not one's fundraising prowess.
My boss, Eamon, who always gets the right to have a question, he submitted quite a few, but going off of this, the question that I want to pick from his is, does it really ever make a difference who is or isn't elected president of the United States? I think after 4 years of Trump, we can probably say that yes, it does make a difference. But I think a lot of small state libertarians would, in a dream world, would hope that it wouldn't.
Yeah. So yes, I think it matters, right? I think to put be able to answer it a little bit the other way. So I think if you look at the European press, which is interesting, they are sort of. There's a lot of European politicians who think that U.S. policy change towards Europe is going to radically change. So Biden is not going to go around like sort of deliberately blowing up institutions like NATO, but on substance, I don't think that you're going to see as big of a change as a lot of, like, say, German politicians are expecting, in terms of the U.S. wanting Germany to pull its own weight on defense, right? So that tension, sort of like in U.S.-German relations, doesn't go away just because it's Biden in office now. It's more fundamental of an issue. So in a lot of ways, like, don't overestimate the degree to which all the craziness is Trump. Like, some of it is just like, this is America, and this is like sort of like structurally, like, this is what we're gonna support. So yes, it matters. Like, yes, there will be a difference, but don't be careful when you look at the issues and think about what actually will the substantive change be.
I hope Eamon was happy with that answer. I'm sure he'll let us know after the fact. I had a question in advance from Charlie Sherwood, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just to get the point across, but Democrats didn't perform as well as the polls expected. Polling errors aside, what do you think the Democrats did wrong, and what should they do differently in future elections? A lot of people have theories that this was a rejection of the far left side of the Democratic Party, that people really weren't taken with their policies. Does anyone agree with that sentiment, or do we have some different theories?
I'll take that one. There's been a lot of talk over the past week, really since Tuesday, about who is the winner of this election. I'm really plugged into the left-wing politics to kind of see what's happening, and there's been a lot of, frankly, nonsense about how everyone who lost, every House member who lost was against Medicare for all, for example. But you can easily point out that the people who were against Medicare for all were moderates in swing districts that were at risk. So they weren't against Medicare for all for no good reason. They were against it because they wanted to win a difficult election against a Republican challenger. I mean, it's tough to say. I think at the national level, there is a desire amongst Americans that the president that they want, or especially amongst Democrats, that the president that they want is like an Obama-esque figure, where you're going to be a liberal on policies, but you are a procedural conservative in many ways. You're patriotic. You're not like seeking to tear down the system. Bernie has now lost 2 primary elections. And I think that does say that regardless of what some louder Democrats might say about what the direction of the Democratic Party should be, that the desire amongst rank and file Democrats is to see a center-left, give or take, nominee for their president. In House races, though, I do think the trend that is going to be worrying going forward is that the left will continue to make inroads on primarying moderates in safe Democratic districts. So there's no reason why members of Congress in cities like San Francisco, LA, DC, and several other cities where they're going to be winning by plus 30, regardless of who the Republican nominee is, can't be far left Democrats. And as we're seeing, they're really making a push that for moderate members such as Abigail Spanberger in suburban Virginia and Connor Lamb in suburban Pennsylvania, who are at risk from losing to Republicans, that they believe they should be changing their views or should be out of the party. And I think that's a worrying trend. The Democratic Party cannot win elections unless you have those voters and those candidates. So while you might want them to be a bit more radical, ultimately you have to accept the fact that you have to run on certain policies to win in certain areas. So, I mean, I think it's hard to say ultimately, in a short answer, what the ideological winner of this election is. But I'd say in the short term that the center left procedural conservative wing of the Democratic Party really made a statement here and said that this is what the Democratic Party wants and this is how it should work going forward.
Another question from our audience. This is from Christian Jacobson. Given a Republican-held Senate, would you expect Mitch McConnell to repeat the obstruction tactics of the Obama era? And would you expect Biden to be better equipped to deal with that, if so?
I'm happy to take this. I would not expect that Mitch McConnell is going to undergo some sort of fundamental personality change between now and the 20th of January. But I would say that, particularly depending on how these races in Georgia turn out, it may not entirely be up to him. The Biden administration may find itself in a position where it only needs to peel away 2, 3, 4 votes from the Republican caucus, and the existence of a number of moderates, Susan Collins, who survived her race in Maine, Mitt Romney out of Utah. I could see those being figures who would somewhat frequently break ranks with whatever the leadership was asking them to do on a given vote, to vote with the Biden administration and with the democratically controlled House if they felt that it was reasonable, proportional, etc. So from my own view, I think that it would probably be no bad thing at this stage to have fresh blood for the leadership of the party, not just at the top, but also within the House and the Senate. That being said, I doubt that Mitch is going to be relinquishing control of the gavel anytime soon.
I have a question from John Johnson, and I kind of want to bring it into our final wrap up. He says, when the election of Biden is confirmed, do the panel think there's any chance of Trump throwing his toys out of the pram and just checking out of the White House early? And that may be a little bit of an extreme way to phrase it, but what are our thoughts for the transition period? And I think we've seen some worrying tweets in the last few weeks. Are we going up for 2 months of this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a risk, like we've seen with the Secretary of Defense being fired. We've, I think that the one way I could imagine things going forward is that the administration just sort of like looks to do as much, damage is not exactly the right word, because I'm sure from their perspective they would see it as an improvement, but they want to make as much hard to reverse change as possible in the next 2 months, right? And sort of impose some sunk costs that make it hard to that are hard to undo. So I could totally see Trump approving sort of that kind of tactic to try to hamstring Biden as much as he can, as he comes into office. I wouldn't put that past him at all.
Yeah,
I think.
typically.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, typically what happens is that one candidate concedes, and that allows the incumbent president to begin the transition. Else is what we're seeing is that the Trump administration kind of wants to wait this out until the Electoral College certifies the election results in December, which cuts the transition period in half. Obviously, the Biden administration can do some things before then, but there is an important period where the Trump administration is supposed to start handing off administrative duties to the incoming Biden administration, prepare them for it, set up documents, and they're making it clear they're not going to do that before certification. And even after certification, there's nothing stopping them from doing the bare minimum. I do think Trump will finish out his term. On the topic of betting markets, getting back to it, I think it's the last position I have is that Trump will actually finish his term. And if you want to make some easy money, you probably can put money on him finishing his term and make a decent return. But it's going to be a difficult 2 months, and I think it's going to hamper the ability of the Biden administration in January to get off on the right foot and kick things off from the start.
Molly, do you have any final thoughts of what you're looking for in the next 2 months? What you're keeping your eyes on?
Well, I think this is certainly going to be a nerve-wracking time to be a member of the Trump cabinet. Mike Esper's firing yesterday, illustrating that particularly well. I've heard some chatter that the director of the CIA, Christopher Wray, may be the next on the chopping block for opposing some of the more legally questionable aspects of what Trump has wanted to do during his time in office. So I think we will probably see quite a bit more shifting within that space, although it's unclear what sort of effect that's going to have on policy. I mentioned this earlier, but obviously anything which is done by executive order, without being too simplistic about it, can be undone by executive order. So the extent to which Trump is actually able to legislate during this period, that may end up being quite a hindrance to the incoming Biden administration. But if, as we've seen thus far, he remains very reliant on that which he can do on his own, then I would say that the primary areas of danger are, as they have been throughout the entirety of his administration, on foreign policy and trade policy, where Congress has ceded an extraordinary amount of control, particularly over the last 40 years, to the institution of the presidency, because quite frankly, Congress didn't want to deal with him, particularly in the case of trade policy. It was considered too hot button, and they didn't really want electoral responsibility for those decisions which had to be made. So as a trade person, I am incredibly nervous about what the next 2 months might hold, because it is entirely possible that Trump could take us out of additional trading architecture. This is a somewhat institutional point, but the United States was recently responsible for blocking the woman seen as the consensus candidate for the next Director General of the World Trade Organization, because she was seen to be too much of a globalist. And that decision, taken in what is now known as the waning days of this administration, will have an effect on the WTO through the next term of office of the DG. And so those are the sorts of decisions I'm going to be looking out for.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we are out of time. We have so many questions that we couldn't get to, and I'm so sorry for those of you that submitted them. But the webinar will be available after the fact on YouTube and our website, so feel free to leave comments there and start a discussion. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for their time and effort. It was a wonderful discussion, and I really think that we touched on a lot of the prescient issues of the day. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can join us next week, same time, same place. Thank you.